There's been a lot of talk about looming carbon legislation, and even so much as to call it a CO2K problem akin to the Y2K problem 10 years ago. But the question is there really a problem around carbon regulation, and does it affect data centers with as profound an impact as people are claiming? So the carbon reduction commitment in the United Kingdom, or now known as the Energy Efficiency Scheme, went into effect in 2010. It was passed in 2008, and it impacts any environment, any data center or facility that has 6,000 megawatt hours per year of consumption, or which really breaks down to about 684 kilowatts of demand in terms of data center energy requirements. That's about 1,000 to 2,000 servers. And so it affects quite a large number of IT environments. But the reality is CRC was started as a cap and trade system. It really was to encourage reduction in energy and trading of that energy credits across different companies. But recently it's been turned into really just a flat carbon tax. And in fact, the government has decided to delay trading until 2013 so that they can consult with industry to best structure this carbon tax in a way that's fair for all the participants. And with a new government in place, and a country and a global economy that's still rebuilding from a recession, the question is, are people really going to tolerate a new tax that may stifle business growth within the United Kingdom? And so companies, a lot of enterprises are really just waiting. They're going to wait until the energy efficiency scheme goes into effect. Once it goes into effect, they'll figure out what they have to pay. They'll pay it the first few years, and then they'll put into place improvement incentives and initiatives in order to meet the needs of the scheme, if that financially makes sense. And that's something that you have to evaluate. So where is this going? Well, a number of enterprises have already been installing metering because, let's face it, there will be some sort of regulation that comes around carbon. Nobody really knows what, whether it's carbon reporting, a flat carbon tax, whether it's a cap and trade system. And since I'm an IT guy, I come from an IT background, the question is, well, how will it ultimately impact SLAs? And as we go to get co-location space or build data centers, will we now specify that what the carbon footprint or carbon consumption of that facility or IT environment is? Will our applications now say it has to fit within this carbon environment? My perspective is no, that's not really coming anytime soon. If we look at it, there's the IT side of the house, which really focuses on performance. And SLA is really a performance-focused agreement, whereas the facilities focus more on the power bill and are going to be more concerned about this tax on carbon. And so when you look at an SLA, it doesn't have, for example, requirements for cooling. When we install hardware, that does, but an application SLA fundamentally hasn't had those notions. And so I don't know why we would think that carbon would come into those SLAs any quicker than, say, a cooling requirement or a power density or a requirement for floor weight or things like that. The reality is, when you talk to the co-location providers or even within large enterprises, the carbon tax or CRC or energy efficiency scheme, they're planning on just passing that on to whoever's using the IT services, which means at the end of the day, your bill is going to go up by a few percent, and that's going to be really factored into the cost of power. And the reality is, we all know that power is increasing in cost year over year, and so there's a need to look at what that increase is versus what it is with the carbon tax. That's probably not a very high increase. And so there is some talk of carbon laundering, which is essentially moving IT services to another country, such as cities like Amsterdam, Brussels, Paris, Frankfurt, and Zurich, where there is no looming carbon legislation, and as a result there's less risk. I think this is a risk move rather than a financially motivated move, but it makes sense, and we're seeing companies do it. So this carbon tax could negatively impact the UK rebuilding of the economy. At the end of this discussion, though, is the CRC focused on the right things, and are data centers an abnormality in this context? And I think they are. Really, the question is, should we reduce our energy consumption and therefore reduce our carbon? If you look at it purely from a financial perspective, and you run a 1 megawatt data center, which would be subject to this carbon reduction scheme, the power savings, let's say 25% power savings on that 1 megawatt data center, would be around £200,000 a year. On the other hand, if I can reuse that 25% of capacity to put more services and deliver more value to the business, I can defer the building of data centers for years, I can defer the purchase of new equipment, and that's going to save me millions of pounds over the course of a few years. So the reality is that better utilizing capacity, keeping your energy use constant while allowing your IT services to grow, that ultimately leads to a 5 to 10 times greater financial return than the energy savings alone. So unless our carbon tax is 5 to 10 times what the cost of power is, the reality is there's no financial motivator and there's no disruptor which is going to encourage a different behavior. This is not just an artifact in the carbon reduction scheme and in the United Kingdom, but LEED in the United States, which is a certification for green buildings, and Neighbors in Australia also has a problem identifying performance, or what's the value I get out of my data center and IT environment versus what's the energy used. And so we really need to look at that if we're going to look at the ultimate reduction of carbon, because we need to look at that on a per service or per application basis. At the end of the day, the CO2K thing isn't going to happen. It's just like Y2K. It's going to fizz out, and we really need to take a better look at what this carbon tax means. And at the end of the day, today, it doesn't mean very much of a change in business in IT environments.